We're going to get the next session started. My name is Jenny Lamb, and I'm a Communication Department faculty member at the University of Delaware, and also a faculty affiliate of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Ithaca Initiative at University of Delaware. We are here to talk about freedom of the press, threats, challenges, and opportunities. So we're going to start by having each of the panelists introduce themselves briefly and make a few comments about what they see as some of the key threats and challenges and opportunities with regard to freedom of the press. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay? Would you like to go ahead?
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for having me putting together what's been an amazing summit. The panels have really been fantastic, and we're in a beautiful venue. And a shout out to the Kalimera Kalispera, to the large Greek contingent here. So my name is Adrian Shahbaz. I'm the Vice President for Research at Freedom House. We're a nonprofit founded in 1941 to advance and defend freedom around the world. And in addition to the advocacy and some of the frontline support that we do around the world, we are perhaps best known for our research, and particularly our flagship report, Freedom in the World, that I think speaks to a lot of the issues that have come up in today's talks. And one data point that I wanted to start at is, according to our research, we've seen 18 consecutive years of decline in global freedom. And so what we're measuring are political rights and civil liberties. And when we looked at that 18 years of data, what stood out was one indicator, one of the 25 indicators on freedom of the media. That's the indicator that has declined the most, more than any indicator that we've seen. And so essentially what we found is attacks on the media are driving the decline of global democracy. And when we look at what those types of threats are, and I'll start with the threats, they are very diverse. I think starting from the physical threats that people face, that journalists face in their work. Mexico, unfortunately, known as the most dangerous place to perform journalism because of the costs of exposing corruption, covering organized crime, and even just local politics. It's an extremely dangerous place to be doing this work. And then when we look at imprisonment as some of the legal threats that journalists are facing, the very sobering statistic from CPJ of over 300 journalists, the Committee to Protect Journalists, thank you, over 300 journalists imprisoned as of December 2023, and the leading imprisoners of journalists are China, Belarus, and Myanmar, or Burma. So it's interesting then to dig into the data a little bit more about what are the laws that are being used to imprison journalists. And what's really striking, when we talk about the risk and the threat of disinformation, it's actually laws that are passed ostensibly to counter disinformation that are then used to criminalize the practice of independent journalists. And so you have journalists in many countries around the world who are imprisoned for, quote unquote, spreading false news, because that news or that information is things that the government doesn't want to hear or that other powerful interests don't want to hear. And so they label it incorrectly as false. And then when governments do not want to be seen as imprisoning journalists for what they're doing, they use all sorts of other laws. And so they use anti-money laundering laws, foreign funding laws, tax evasion. They even look at laws for drug use or for terrorism. Wildly fake charges that they throw to these journalists in order to get them in prison so that they stop doing their work. What's interesting to see is this crackdown on journalists is happening. And when we look at the global picture, 18 years ago, you had 14 countries that scored the worst in our index for press freedom. Over the past 18 years, it's jumped from 14 to now 36. So you have a huge jump in places where there is presently no press freedom. And that, I think, is then matched to this idea that democracy around the world is under threat. What's been fascinating to see, though, is when we look at those countries like Afghanistan, Belarus, Nicaragua, Russia, and even Turkey, where there has been a rapid crackdown on the media, and it's pushed journalists outside of their country fearing for their lives or because they want to be able to continue their journalism outside of the country. All of these range of threats follows them to their new adopted countries. And so I think Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist for the Washington Post, who was then killed by Saudi agents in an embassy in Istanbul, that's just one example. And according to our research, we found over 112 other incidents of physical acts of transnational repression. And so that's governments reaching across their borders to silence dissent. So what we're seeing is that authoritarianism is going global. It's not just restricted to the countries where these governments are ruling, but that the threats to journalists are even happening in democracies. There was an Iranian journalist who just recently was stabbed outside of his home in London because he's a broadcaster with let's say, a media outlet that is critical of the regime. There was a Vietnamese journalist who all of a sudden disappeared while in Thailand. And then when they reappeared, they were in jail in Hanoi in Vietnam. So it's this unfortunate sense that, journalists are not safe. And I think that's what we need to be able to protect journalists, whether they're in their countries, whether they have left their countries. There are so many tactics that are used, whether it's surveillance against them, whether it is threats against their families who are back home to coerce them to stop their media reporting. And then it's also very difficult for them to settle in new countries because of the legal threats they face. I mean, you have some journalists who are branded as terrorists by these authoritarian governments that then makes it impossible for them to, let's say, start a bank account in the US because people are doing their due diligence. So they're like, wait, I think I have a terrorist here. And they're like, no, you don't understand. My government has labeled me a terrorist for all these reasons. So it's a really depressing picture to paint, at least on the threats. I talked about these challenges about what it's like to be able to do journalism in so many, even when journalists have left these really harsh environments. But I wanted also to end on hopefully like a little bit of an optimistic point, which is the opportunities. And I'm sure we can get into this more, but there are so many great initiatives that are springing up to protect exiled journalists, to provide them with the support that they need, the legal support. There's new funding models that are coming out. I think a few have been discussed, whether that's on crowdfunding, on membership models. And so we're starting to see different innovation happening around the world, which is, I'm enthusiastic about that. But I think overall, it's a very depressing picture, both when it comes to press freedom and then also on democracy.
Eliza?
So I'm working as an investigative reporter for Inside Story. It's a small but well-known independent online media outlet that broke the story about the surveillance scandal known as Predator Gate, named after Watergate. So you might notice that a few months ago, Biden administration blacklisted and sectioned several legal entities, like Intellection, a number of individuals related with this particular spyware scandal. I don't like to brag, but our reporting at Inside Story contributed to this a bit.
You should brag.
At the same time, the Greek government, including our prime minister, attacked whoever tried to shed light on this scandal, including journalists, even members of an independent authority that is protected by our constitution. And also note that many of acting ministers were under surveillance with this spyware, including the current and previous Minister of Foreign Affairs. Unfortunately, 2.5 years since our first report, Greek prosecutors haven't yet held anyone accountable, nor have they pressed any charges against known businessmen and government officials. I myself was under physical surveillance while reporting with my colleague Tassos Eloglu about the illegal use of spyware by the Greek government against journalists and politicians. And this pretty much sums up the problem with media freedom in Greece. As Anakithia Bouzoukou mentioned previously, the surveillance of journalists, either physical or digital, and the fact that the murder of a colleague outside his house in 2021 remains unsolved is the main reason why Greece ranks the lowest among all other EU member states, European Union member states, in the Media Freedom Index from Reporters Without Borders for 3 consecutive years. At Inside Story, we like to stress the fact that we are independent, as all media outlets and journalists should be, in order to differentiate ourselves from the norm. As my colleague Danai Maragoudaki from Solomon, also a small and independent media outlet in Greece, mentioned in a previous panel, in Greece, the norm is that medias are either state-owned, which means that they are controlled by each government, either they are in the hands of oligarchs with several conflicting business interests. To give an example, after we first reported that a Greek journalist was illegally targeted with such an intrusive and powerful weapon, basically, as predator spyware, no one from the mainstream media reported anything about it. If someone bought a newspaper or opened a TV station the next day, it would be like nothing had happened. A few days after, it was also revealed that the same journalist, Thanasis Koukakis, was also under legal surveillance from the National Intelligence Service. Again, nothing in the mainstream media. This continued for months until the leader of the third largest political party revealed that he was also targeted by the same spyware and he was under legal surveillance. In this depressing landscape, one might think that independent media outlets in Greece, like Inside Story, that have the public interest as their main compass, would work as an oasis for the Greek citizens. But first, I have to admit that working for a independent media outlet and investigating stories that the mainstream media don't want to touch makes my job a lot easier because I have less competition. But at the same time, the fact that the mainstream medias for decades are not doing their job, basically they're not holding anyone, the powerful, basically accountable, is the main reason, in my opinion, why the trust in the media in Greece is one of the lowest in European Union. And this is also a problem for us, the journalists that working for who work for independent media outlets. So we have we have the privilege to report freely on matters that actually matter. But we, at the same time, we have to persuade the public that we have good intentions. And this is not an easy task, especially when we are a subscription-based media outlet. Subscriptions help us safeguard our independence because in Greece, not depending on advertisement means freedom, media freedom, basically. So in this context, we have to work harder to reach out our audience and persuade them that by actively supporting our work, not only Inside Story, but also all the other small independent media outlets in Greece, they basically support transparency and accountability and thus democracy. So, in my opinion, I don't know who was yesterday who participated in the dialogues yesterday. The question basically was citizens or consumers. So, in my opinion, the thing that I just mentioned is where being a citizen coincides with being a consumer, meaning that you have to be careful on what kind of news you consume and try to support efforts that respect you as a citizen.
Suzanne?
Thank you. I'm Suzanne McBride. I'm a journalism professor, but I also work as a journalist. I'm an editor and an editorial writer for the Chicago Sun-Times. And I'm humbled by listening to both Adrian and Eliza about some of the challenges that are happening worldwide. And I think it's good context when we talk about what's happening in terms of journalism and the information you all get here in the United States. I would say the threat is serious, but not to the degree where we have journalists disappearing off the streets. We don't have journalists who are being imprisoned. We don't have journalists who are being shot down, assassinated in their driveways. So I think that's a positive thing. I think it says more about the bad things that are happening around the world than necessarily good things happening here. But I need to put that in context. That said, when you have a former president now running for president again who is threatening and has threatened journalists, wants to try them for treason, has even intimated that they should be killed for their reporting, it makes me very nervous because I feel that those threats have been to a certain extent normalized. It's hard for me to imagine someone like President Ronald Reagan saying that, let alone having that be accepted as just what happens now in this age of social media. And so I think that's something that we all kind of have to think about on an everyday basis. Like, do we accept that? Do we think that's okay for public figures, especially someone running for president in this country, to be threatening journalists? The other thing that's a really big threat to journalists is how few newspapers there are in this country. How few media outlets regularly cover what's happening in each of your neighborhoods and communities. We used to have more than 116,000 journalists back in 2005 when I joined Columbia College. We now have fewer than 85,000, and I'm not even sure if we really have that number, depending on how you define journalists. And what that means is there are far fewer people going to government meetings. There are far fewer people telling you how your government is spending your money. Far fewer people trying to, give you information for you to act on. Like, are you okay with, these laws are being passed in your states and in your cities? So I think that's a big problem. Another big problem, I think, is the culture of secrecy that we have in this country. And on the one hand, we can consume media, we can see photos, we can see video 24/7, but yet it's much harder for us to get access to information about our government. Florida is considered the best state in the country, has been for many years, in terms of freedom and access to public records and documents. Over the last decade, that's changed dramatically. Many more records are now private in that state. If you want to be a public university president in Florida, your application is no longer public. If you just think about that for a minute, that's someone who works for the citizens of the state of Florida, and that information is private. And we've basically, as citizens, allowed that to happen. Very few of us have spoken up on a regular basis to say, that's not right, we need access to that information. Secrecy is now the default in terms of finding out information, makes our reporting much harder to do, and in turn means the information that you get is much more one-sided and much more opaque. And that really greatly affects democracy and how you can determine what kind of government we should have. The other thing I want to quickly mention is something called pink slime. I don't know if any of you heard of the pink slime. So pink slime is the term given to very slick newspapers and websites that have cropped up in recent years that political candidates and their operatives have put out there. And if you're not careful, it may actually look like legitimate news. And it's really, at the very local level in many Midwestern states, including in Illinois, has caused quite a problem. And that's where you all play a role. You all, if you're discerning in your information that you get, if you ask good questions, if you try to really interrogate the information you get, you would hopefully see that pink slime is what it is. Two positive things I want to say before we get back to your very good questions. What high school and middle school students are doing, the kind of journalism that you all are doing is phenomenal. We now have 18 states in this country that have passed laws, Minnesota most recently earlier this month, that give journalists at your age and your level much more freedom to report on what's happening in your schools, what's happening in your communities. And that gives me great hope. The other thing that I'm very hopeful about is college media. We have college media performing really important functions. As you've seen, debate and dissension about what's happening in Gaza. where that's been reported across college campuses, and in many cases, it's been reported by college journalists because colleges and universities have been limiting access to professional journalists. And so that information is getting out there because of what the good work that college journalists are doing. We also increasingly have colleges and universities that are trying to take over or step into that vacuum when a local newspaper closes. University of Iowa, my alma mater, just bought their student newspaper there just bought 2 community papers that were about to go out of business. That's great for journalists who are training to do this work. It's even better for those people who live in those areas because now they're going to get the news and information that might have been lost otherwise. Lastly, I'm very optimistic about something called the Press Act at the federal level. It's a federal shield law, which was unanimously passed by the U.S. House. I just want to say unanimous because I don't know if you guys pay attention to what the U.S. House of Representatives does, but that's a pretty divisive body right now and has been for a number of years. And they unanimously passed a law that would give reporters at the federal level some protections in terms of having government come in and subpoena them, force them to testify. It's a really, really important development. I'm hoping the U.S. Senate will take it up soon, but that also gives me hope.
Okay. I have a couple of things to add as well. First of all, I wanted to jump on what you were saying about the president and such, saying, targeting the press as the enemy of the people and that sort of thing. There's this concept of stochastic terrorism, and this doesn't just have to do with the press, but anybody who's targeted like in that manner over and over again, it becomes statistically more significantly likely that violence will happen directed at that group who has been targeted, but we just don't know when or where it will happen. And there actually have been shootings within the United States at newsrooms. And so I think this is a real concern in the United States as well. And as the previous panel was talking about in the lead up to the election, I think that's going to be an increasing issue. One other thing I wanted to talk about was digital hostility towards journalists, and particularly towards women. There have been surveys that have been done of journalists across many countries, and nearly all journalists experience some form of online harassment. Those tend to be in 2 different areas. First of all, journalists who have higher profiles, particularly journalists who have higher profiles on social media and or who present their information on a video in a video format. So people who are on television or do so online in a video format. I think part of that is that it gives a greater sense of accessibility to those journalists and a greater sense of sort of personal relationship with them. So they are targeted more often. But the thing I want to focus on most is the attacks that are motivated by and or focused on the identity of the journalist in some form. So women, people of color, people who are migrants, for example, are much more likely to be targeted and much more likely to be targeted in a way that's very scary. So a UNESCO study that was done a couple of years ago by the United Nations, 3 of 4 female journalists report being subject to online attacks. And women are more likely to get in those attacks, to be attacked in a way that threatens murder or sexual violence. And so this kind of seriousness, first of all, there's not very good legislative response to such things, and at least in the United States. And there are some effects of this that I think are really important for freedom of the press. One of them is that it can lead to self-censorship or lead journalists to avoid certain topics so as to not become targets, and particularly people who cover politics or issues of disinformation, people who cover things related to gender or race. tend to be the ones who are targeted most frequently, and that has the effect often of making those people step back from the public eye. It also makes it harder to attract and to retain a diverse range of journalists in your newsroom. And interesting, some research was done also that being the subject of such attacks makes a journalist feel and act differently toward the audience, so that now they have a greater wariness of the audience and a greater distrust that the audience is responsive to what they are reporting. And so there is some indication that their reporting becomes challenged and changed as a result of those perceptions of the audience, which I think is an important point as well. I just wanted to talk briefly about the ways in which disinformation is actually used as a weapon against journalists. So disinformation is used about journalists, claiming that they have engaged in some kind of unprofessional activity or telling lies about the journalist in some way. Also, there is a specific use of disinformation to target the credibility of journalists, particularly journalists who are reporting on controversial topics. I do want to wrap this up, our initial part, by talking about one positive thing that I think is going on. An earlier panel said media literacy in the schools would be great. There actually is some increased effort. 3 states in particular, Delaware being one of them, has actually just passed new educational standards requiring the inclusion of media literacy across K-12 education. And when I say, yeah, exactly. And when I say across K-12 education, I mean that they are going to start introducing this in kindergarten, these sort of concepts, and have it go all the way across those years. And not only that, but it's not going to be like a separate little, thing like health class or something. It's going to be integrated in across different disciplines. So it'll be part of your English class, it'll be part of your history class, it'll be part of your math class. And so I think that's a very positive thing. So the 3 that have passed really comprehensive legislation requiring these education standards are Delaware, New Jersey, and California so far. 15 others have passed less comprehensive requirements, so just for high school or just like digital safety kinds of questions. But the Delaware standards, since we're in Delaware, I thought I would talk about that, are really comprehensive, talking about how to engage in responsible and healthy behavior online, critical thinking skills like identifying target marketing strategies and naming the types of persuasion techniques that are being used, and identifying the purpose of media messages and how they're constructed. So looking at the values that are included, the points of view that are included, and the ones that are excluded. And I would like to add to this that I think we talk a lot about teaching people to be skeptical of what they're seeing. I think it's equally important that we begin to teach people what good journalism looks like, so that not just to see what the problems are, but also what is it that is good journalism? What is the process that was followed? Who is the person doing the reporting? What kinds of knowledge are they claiming? How do they know that that is true? What are the sources? Who's not being talked about? And so on. I think it's important to have the positive as well as the, watch out for misinformation. So I wanted to have us very quickly, and I hope you guys will be thinking about some questions that you'd like to ask about these topics. But I would like our panelists to talk very specifically and explicitly about how the kinds of challenges, opportunities, and threats that we've been talking about, the 4 of us, how those relate directly to democratic concerns to democracy. So, Adrian, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I think it gets back to, what is democracy? Yes, it is self-rule. Yes, it is, constitutional rights grounded in free expression. That obviously is applicable to journalism, but I think getting at this third component is checks and balances and oversight. And just thinking back about what is journalism's purpose, I mean, a certain purpose of it is to be adversarial. It is to be asking the tough questions, to be providing, to be the check on tyranny, the check on abuse, the check on corruption. And that's what puts journalists in a very difficult position. But I think that as a society, we need to make sure that we are reinforcing the value of that, and then providing additional protections to journalists because we recognize both the threats that they face and then the value that they provide to democracy. And when you think about what are these other aspects of democracy, what does it need? What are the goods that provides? I mean, thinking about informing the public so that they can make democratic decisions. It's about creating community. And I think that's a really important point. But, when we think about democracy, it is about community. It's about people at the end of the day. And I think that's been a thread through a lot of the panels, is that it's about engaging with people, and journalists, the media plays a very important role about fostering that community. And then, of course, that third component about holding the power to account. And that's incredibly important to make sure that we do not slide into autocracy. And that is unfortunately why journalists face so many of the threats that they face here and around the world.
I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, this was also my thought. If you don't hold the power accountable, then you slide into authoritarian regime. This is the main thing that differentiates a democratic state from an authoritarian one, in my opinion. But I'm a journalist, so I think media freedom is essential to democracy, because if also it engages public to participate in the discussion in a way, because if you have informed citizens, then they have the tools to take the right decisions for their benefit. Because at least in Europe, where, as you might know, far right is rising. Also in Greece, we had a Nazi, basically, party inside our parliament. So neo-Nazis took advantage of the democratic procedure in order to gain somehow public trust and their votes. So if you don't know what is happening to your country, if you have citizens that are indifferent, is in the benefit of the powerful, not you. Because the thing that I see in my country, in other European countries, is that basically politicians want public to be indifferent and just care for their pocket or their short-sighted benefits. So this is my answer to your question.
We've heard this saying, democracy is something you do, not something you have. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of how it applies to media and journalism. I think you could actually say the same thing about journalism as well. It's something you do, either as a journalist you're doing it, or everyone else who's consuming it. Are you actually taking it in? Are you actually reading legitimately reported information? Are you vetting sources? Are you asking your own questions? Because of the democratization of online journalism, anyone can go out there and put out information, which can be really good and really scary. and then you all can weigh in. Like you have an ability to interact with each other, not just here in your geographic communities, but around the world. And so I would just challenge each of us to think about what can you do in terms of advancing democracy in a very small, important way every day, and that's to take in news and information and to actually debate and discuss and maybe even agree to disagree in all these different ways that we can do that. Because I think at a very local level, that's actually what makes our democracy strong too.
I'd like to follow up on something you said in your initial comments, which was that being nonprofit allowed you to be a free press. And so the implication there is that then the for-profit media are less free. And I'm just curious about people's reactions to that because, of course, we live in the United States in a profit-driven media system.
Well, I now work for a news outlet that is part of the largest nonprofit, and that's the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Public Radio, WBEZ. And up until 2 years ago, I worked for a for-profit mainstream newspaper. Now I work for a nonprofit newspaper. And I think I haven't seen much difference yet, but I do really worry about the corporatization of media, and we have fewer now for-profit outlets out there, and we have this amazing consolidation, especially in the broadcast arena, which is not good for democracy. The more entities that have ownership, the better. Now, I won't say like 50 years ago when you had a bunch of white men owning their local newspaper, that wasn't necessarily good for democracy either. So I think we just had to figure out a way. I think the more types of models we have out there, probably the better. I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other.
Just make a correction. We are not a non-profit organization. We have a corporate structure. I mean, we are an SA, but we just want to have a way to pay our salaries. I mean, we don't try to have a huge profit, just to cover the basics. So. I don't believe that being a for-profit or a non-profit should change a lot because being a journalist, owning a media outlet should mean that you abide to some standards, which means have a good sourcing on your stories, speak with all parties, all sides, not always keeping the same distance, but because at the end you have to say something. You cannot just keep the equal distance from all, because someone is accountable for what you are reporting. But I mean, these are pretty much the basics of journalism. We all should abide.
Why then is your news organization willing to tackle topics that mainstream news organizations are not? What is the pressure there?
We are not depending on advertisement. We depend on our readers and their subscriptions. And this gives us the freedom to report on anything. We don't have a special political agenda. We don't have an economical agenda. We don't worry if we write something which might be or considered to be bad for a bank or a telecom provider, which are basically the biggest advertisers in Greece. So I have a good example to give you. We reported about a major hacking incident in the biggest telecom provider in Greece called Cosmote, owned by Deutsche Telekom, which is a state-owned telecom provider in Germany. We reported about a very serious hacking incident, one of the most serious in Europe in the last few decades. We reported about that, and all the other media outlets just had the reply from the company saying everything is under control, don't worry. So this is basically explains the difference.
Can I add one thing here, which is I think we're getting back to what contributes to freedom for journalists. And if we think that freedom for journalists is a good thing, then what can we do to support that freedom? And when I think about some of the costs that some of the smaller outlets or not only face, a lot of it comes down to the costs of defending against cyber attacks. It's like the digital security costs. And then another one is against slaps or strategic lawsuits that are designed frivolous in nature, that are designed really to suck resources from the organization. And so thinking about where some of the innovation has come are these networks like media support networks that are able to provide that type of support. It's almost like insurance where you cluster your resources, you pool your resources together, and then there becomes a solidarity between different journalist outlets. And according to our research, that's something that we're starting to see more and more is journalists, some of these independent journalist outlets feeling like they can be stronger together, pooling the resources to defend against some of these attacks. And then that also playing out as collaboration on sort of these like cross-border investigations in Europe or overseas, particularly when it comes to corruption, where that can play an investigative work, where that can be a great boon for journalism.
Are there any questions from the audience? Do we have microphones? Here we go. I think it's on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Delaware. I'm a student of Dr. Tim Schaefer and Danilo Yannick. So quite interesting. A former African leader, dictator, so to say, once said, "Freedom of speech, I can guarantee, but freedom after speech, I cannot." And when we are talking about these issues, what is even more worrisome is that in democracies around the world, dictators or authoritarians, they find their means into government through democratic means. I am from Nigeria, so I will cite an example. Currently in Nigeria, there are about 2 journalists that I follow regularly that are not in the country because they reported about a popular protest that happened in the country in 2022, the NSAS protest, David Undayi and DJ Switch. The government are clamping down on journalists. And the conversation we are having here today, we can only make meaningful progress, like maximize the opportunities through laws, through policies. How can we really bring policymakers into the conversations to see media and democracy as complementary other than 2 opposing sides? What can we do? From your research as an analyst and from your practice as a journalist, how can we really bring politicians to the table to see that, the media need to report about the good side of the government for people to know what they are doing. And then the media as well, you have your own independent role. Thank you.
Sure, it's a great question, and I think it's part of an overall struggle, maybe to take a step back, because what we're seeing is around the world, these norms about why freedom of the press is important are being weakened. So it used to be that many governments felt like they were pressured against clamping down on journalists because they knew that they were going to be pressured by the United States, by other democracies, by the UN, and that pressure mattered. So there was part of this global infrastructure around what constitutes strong norms for democracy and human rights. And we see that weakening. There's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is around technological disruption, but I think another strong part of it is the rise of actors like China, the Chinese government, the Russian government, regional actors that are much more bold in promoting more authoritarian norms. shaping, and then that has an effect of governments, whether it's in Nigeria, in places in South America, where they then say, well, China's doing this, and they're quite successful. They actually are doing quite well in economic development. So why wouldn't we be following their model? Why is it that we actually need free speech? So it's a really important, because and it's really incumbent on democracies, I think, to be pushing out that message to shape why free expression is so important. It is, and it's particularly challenging in today's days when there is so much different models that are out there. It's not the 1990s where it was just clear, like everybody was striving towards democracy. Now, it's democracies are having problems. Authoritarianism is on the rise, and they are very good at doing their own self-promotion, even when things aren't going well in places like Russia and China. So it's a really interesting question. I think it's, ultimately it comes down to what is that type of pressure that we can provide, and then how can the actors on the ground actually be showing why this is important? So it's not something that is being imposed by the outside, by the United States or by others, but it's actually Nigerians or others, citizens who are saying that this is helping us, this is the type of freedom that we want. And when that message, hopefully it just comes back to people, and people being able to promote that message, hold their governments accountable, and also to say what is the kind of country that they want.
Other questions?
Good morning, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. I'm going to bring a little skepticism to the room, and I think a lot of times we hear a great deal about the responsibility of citizenry to become educated, media literate, to be discerning in the way they consume information, and that puts a lot of responsibility on everyday citizens versus those who are producing and sharing news and information. How do we maintain an open and free press, protection for quality journalism, while also holding journalists accountable who may be sloppy, who may be distributing themselves misinformation and disinformation? You've talked about how some people are threatened, jailed for sharing accurate information by different governments, using that as a way to weaponize the process. But there are also people who adhere to that journalism title or identity who are not doing a good job. How do we manage that while not simply just saying we as consumers of information need to be more discerning? Thank you.
I would say, in terms of holding journalists responsible for repeated acts of misinformation, so the case of the Dominion voting systems against Fox News, I think, was a great example of that, where they were able to get a huge settlement because they had repeatedly, and there were emails from within the company showing that they knew what they were saying was false, and they were still saying it. So I do think that some existing laws, like libel laws, are useful in those kinds of big situations. But I think in smaller kinds of settings, that's where you get into the really, like, what do you do if there's a local journalist who's being sloppy? And I hope that professional organizations will have some role with that. I do hope that citizens will vote with their eyeballs and not, follow that person as much. But it's a tricky situation because those laws that you might pass to penalize somebody are then weaponized against the people who are doing journalism well because they're saying something critical of the government. And so it's a very, very tricky balancing act, I think.
I think another really basic thing is Boy, when I was a new journalist, I did make mistakes. And some of the mistakes I discovered much later. And it was not because anyone bothered to call in, because we called in back in those days. We didn't have the internet. Or even write a little letter to me to say, that was wrong. So I really think on a very local and also global level, if you see something that's not right, it's so much easier now to try to correct it. And yes, that's putting one more thing on the citizen, that's, someone who's already very busy, having an everyday life, but that's how we correct information. I mean, it is so easy for stuff to be repeated much more dangerously, and not necessarily maliciously. Like, when you're doing stories 24/7, you're going to get things wrong. And I think what you need to do is hold all of us as journalists accountable to reach out and say, hey, I don't think this is right. And then we need to correct it right away. The other thing, of course, is in the online world, sometimes you can comment, not always. We've shut off comments on lots of different types of stories for a lot of reasons. That's a whole nother panel. But that's another way to actually put out information. I really feel that the solution to improving information or stopping bad information is not to stop it. It's more information to correct it. I mean, I'm a big believer in that. I know it's kind of sloppy and it doesn't always work, but I get very nervous also about laws being developed to deal with an aberration or one case, because that's where you get really bad ramifications down the road.
I would like to add, I totally agree with you. We have a responsibility as journalists to provide quality news to the public. In Greece, in many other countries, there's a thing called code of conduct. We have to respect that. In Greece also, we don't have journalists spreading misinformation. We just have journalists just reporting on one side of the story, which is the government story or this corporate story or the other. So this is a very tricky thing, because they are not reporting anything that is not true, but they are twitching the message in a way, the message that comes through your TV screen. So maybe strong journalistic unions that can impose the code of conduct to all of us would be a solution, not laws that might turn against us.
I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, and I know that we're the only thing between you and lunch, so we're going to wrap it up. Thanks very much.
Thank you.